So in this lecture, we're going to talk about Indian removal, specifically to Kansas, but Indian removal was a larger event that happened in U.S. history that affected thousands upon thousands of Native Americans, both in the southeast portion of the United States as well as in the Great Plains when they were forced to live in small areas and in new environments. So let's see how this started. So first, make sure you record the essential question on your Cornell notes, the one in bold. The smaller questions below are kind of guiding questions to help you be able to answer this essential question. So I want to start with this idea of manifest destiny, which was one of your vocabulary words. While this phrase was not used until after Indian removal took place, this idea was already in the American mindset. And this man on the right side, John O'Sullivan, kind of coined this term, and this was the idea that the United States should extend across the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And the idea was, they believed, we are the greatest people on earth. Let's spread democracy and freedom across the entire land and bring it to all these people. And we're better than everyone else. We're going to ignore the claims of other countries to the land, including Native Americans, and so let's spread across and bring our lifestyle to the rest of this land because we're the best. So that's kind of this mindset that's going on during this time and highly influences this idea of Indian removal. So where did this all start? The Louisiana Purchase was added to the United States early on, when it, after it became a country. And this map is good. It shows you the states that had already been there. In fact, I will have a link to an interactive map where you can kind of look and see how the nation expanded if you want to on your own. But this little chunk where it says Louisiana Purchase was added. So, bought it from France in 1803. It had actually been controlled by Spain. It was turned over to France. This is when Napoleon Bonaparte was ruling, and he was in war with Great Britain and needed money to fund that, so he sold it, and the United States took the opportunity because it literally doubled the size of the United States. And when this happened, of course, this is untamed wilderness to the United States. It's not been touched. Of course, it has been by Native Americans, but they didn't view it that way. And they send all these explorers out to come back with information about this new land. So here's a couple of the routes of the explorers. We have Lewis and Clark expedition, which many of you have probably heard of. Zebulon Pike. The one they don't have on here is Stephen Long, which we'll talk about as well. So what's really important is how this land became known as the Great American Desert. So this guy, Zebulon Pike, explored extensively throughout the middle of what would become Kansas, and he was actually trying to take a group of Native Americans out to the Great Plains. And he took extensive notes. He described the area as dry and sandy. He even compared it to the deserts of Africa. Basically, he said it would be useless for settlement because he felt that agriculture could not take root there. And then, of course, there's this guy, Stephen H. Long. A few years later, he went out and explored as well. Funny enough, he was sent to map the area. He never actually went into Kansas. He attempted to get into the Kansas River, but couldn't due to a flood that had occurred, and he went around it. And he was the first American to publish a map and an atlas of this new area, and across the middle of this map, he labeled the area and other parts of what would become Kansas as the Great American Desert. So these two people, Zebulon Pike and Stephen H. Long, painted this picture of this uninhabitable land, terrible for settlement, and no good for the United States. This is really important, too, when it comes to Indian removal. In fact, this is what he said: "In regard to this extensive section of country, I do not hesitate in giving the opinion that it is almost wholly unfit for cultivation and, of course, uninhabitable by people depending on agriculture for subsistence. Although tracts of fertile land considerably extensive are occasionally to be met with, yet the scarcity of wood and water, almost uniformly prevalent, will prove an insuperable obstacle in the way of settling the country. This region, however, may prove of infinite importance to the United States, inasmuch as it is calculated to serve as a barrier to prevent too great extension of our population westward, and secure against the machinations or incursions of an enemy. So he kind of saw it as a barrier, a physical barrier, nothing more. So as I was talking about earlier with this idea of manifest destiny, one of these ideas was for the United States to expand westward across the entire continent. So the United States population was growing rapidly. There was a desire for people, they wanted more land. And the reason for that is because most people made their money and living from farming. Subsistence farmers, they grew their own food, made their own items, very self-dependent. And so people wanted access to new lands. Additionally, there was fear of European invasion. Still a new country, really, when you think about it, and there was fear of that as well. So we wanted to secure the boundaries, the borders of the United States. So this is when Indian removal comes in. Before the Indian Removal Act even came into place, when we purchased the Louisiana Territory, Native Americans were encouraged to give up their land. They were also encouraged to assimilate into American culture. This picture here kind of describes that of a Native American going to visit Washington, D.C., and then returning home, and they've been Americanized here. That's what assimilate means, to basically have the customs of Americans. And many of them did. In fact, one of them, the Cherokee Nation, pretty much lived like Americans by the 1830s, and they had businesses, they had a newspaper, they had a written language. They even dressed and looked like Americans. You could hardly tell. However, many refused this option. So in 1830, under the leadership of President Andrew Jackson, the United States government passed the Indian Removal Act. And what it did was give the government the power to exchange lands with Native Americans in the East for lands in the West, specifically this area of the Great American Desert. And again, many tribes didn't want to do this. However, in the end, many were tricked and forced, essentially, to take part in this. This map shows you kind of where these tribes were removed from. A lot of them, like I said, from the southeast. Famously, the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears, but of course, many from the north as well. And these tribes came into Kansas. They were forced to live on reservations, which are areas designated for Native Americans. In fact, you see all of this map over here where all these different tribes came and were forced into Kansas. So they were given this land that we said was unsuitable for us, but it was good enough for them. And a little picture of these reservations here, designated specifically for different tribes. What's really important to note is that many of these tribes were forced to go from one environment to a very different one in Kansas, where they had different resources, a different climate, and that transition was very challenging for them. Many died in the process, and it caused a lot of conflict as well between these Native American tribes. Many missionaries were established in these reservations as well, schools specifically where children were forced to stay separate from their parents, where they would be converted to Christianity. They were taught job skills, taught English, and again, this idea of Americanization of the Indian, where we want you to become American because it's for your best interest. So Native Americans really lost out on this one. They didn't want to leave. They didn't think they would be forced to, but they were in the end because the United States was land hungry. And they give them a piece of subpar land that we viewed as not good for us.